I've been told that you should remove your hat when you're inside a place, but I ran into my sadistic dermatologist the other day, and he over zapped my head. So I'm going to spare you all the difficulty of looking at it and saying, poor Chris. Okay. Our speaker, who wants to be called by Russ, loves a good challenge, especially if it means building relationships across boundaries and borders to achieve a shared vision for change. A North Carolina native who has lived and served in 7 states and the United Kingdom, Russ returned to Durham in 2019 to serve as the Executive Director of Housing for New Hope. He previously worked at Church World Services, including serving as the national head of the Crop Hunger Walks, which partners with more than 1,000 communities across this country. He also served as the executive with United Methodist Church's Mission, Relief, and Development Agency, leading a team that annually raised more than $40 million for 600 community-based projects in more than 100 countries. Rush has relished the opportunity to serve one community and focus his energy on the affordable housing crisis and its impact on our most vulnerable neighbors, those experiencing homelessness. So without further ado, please welcome Russ.
Good afternoon. It is good to be with you today. I never know what to send for those intros. When I went to work for United Methodist Global Ministries, our press release writer, who was, I think, 80 at the time, he'd been doing the work for 50 years and he stayed on just for that, because I was a member of the cabinet, said, we have to write this so that it sounds like you're worthy of your job. So every time I hear an intro, I'm like, oh, that sounds a little bit like what Elliot would want me to say. I need to tone that down, but I appreciate the invitation. So I am going to, you should have near you, probably make reference a few times to the state of homelessness and housing in Durham. And I apologize, all the data I've got is Durham, but I will do my best to extrapolate into other neighboring places. Our problem has some very unique, distinctive pieces in Durham that are worth learning from. And that's where all of our work is. We used to actually operate in Chapel Hill too, but retreated to just Durham about 6 or 7 years ago. So I'll go through, and I know there's time for Q&A at the end. If you've got a burning question as we go, it is no problem to flag that. It doesn't distract me or anything. I always just reserve the right to say, hang on, I'm going to get there in a minute. And if I don't remember, then you absolutely have the right to flag back at me and be like, you said you were going to answer this. And I do appreciate the sensitivity around the issue. I will say we run into so much day in and day out that we joke sometimes that you have to laugh to keep from crying from some of what we see. So we will do our best on a Sunday afternoon to learn and be lively all together at the same time. I want to start by sharing just a couple of definitions with folks, because if you ever had the chance to work with the government has this, let's see, I did kill myself simply by moving it. Okay. I won't touch it again. One of the things that keeps us that we have to do to laugh to keep from crying is government can just be fun at times, working with government entities. And one of the very interesting things about the federal government is they have 2 different operating definitions of homelessness. One which is far broader than the other, which makes life very interesting. What you see on the screen is HUD's, the Housing and Urban Development Department's definition of homelessness, which very much focuses on people who are living in places that are not meant for human habitation, in emergency shelters, in cars, in abandoned buildings, in parks and parking lots, places like that. What's interesting is there is another part of the federal government that focuses on education and has a definition that we all refer to as McKinney-Vento. All schools have some kind of all public schools have a McKinney-Vento coordinator in it. And their definition is a little broader. So a lot of times, especially when I first came back into my role before we started to grow as much as we did, I answered a lot of calls that came in from clients. And they would start to explain their situation to me and about how to get help. And I would say often, now listen, I'm going to say something that sounds crazy, but I'm going to make the statement and then we're going to unpack it so that it makes sense. So according to McKinney-Vento in the school system, if you are, say, living with a family member because you lost your housing, what we sometimes refer to as couch surfing, McKinney-Vento says you are experiencing homelessness. HUD says, well, that was creative and resourceful. You're staying with grandma or your auntie right now. You solved your situation. The other very interesting one tends to be about motels. So McKinney-Vento says if you are staying in a motel or hotel, that is experiencing homelessness. That is not what we consider stable. HUD says, well, who's paying for that? Because if you're paying for yourself, they say, well done you. You have found a solution to your situation. If someone else, like a faith community or social services or someone is paying for your room, they'll say, okay, then you are technically homeless. And all these definitions come from the fact that we just have overwhelming numbers of people that are seeking help. And so they've had to find ways to have definitions to create prioritization. But it's not unusual to run into some of these definitions and you just want to kind of pull your hair out, what's left of it for some of us, because it feels like it makes things harder. So for the work that we do day in and day out, we run with HUD's definitions because so much of the work we do is related to them. The other definition that's kind of a derivative of the homelessness definition from HUD is chronic homelessness. And this is a really important one. So this is for folks, chronic homelessness means that you have had at least a year documentable of homelessness, according to the HUD definition. Now, because it's the government and they like to have fun with us, you can also have had 4 experiences in 3 years accumulating to a year to hit the definition. It's really fun to try and track that. If not the straight year, but then you also have to have a disabling condition. Most often what we're looking at is folks experiencing severe and persistent mental health, substance use disorder, sometimes physical disabilities, but it's really the first 2 normally, and they're usually kind of wrapped around one another. And we'll talk a little bit more of that in a minute. So that's a lot of what we experience and see day in and day out. So what are we actually seeing? So in Durham and most of our region, we are seeing numbers that are going up. Every year we do something called the PIT count, meaning point in time counts. HUD mandated thing, the fourth Wednesday of January every year. Any guess why we would go out and count people that were experiencing homelessness on the 4th Wednesday of January every year? Any guesses? It's usually one of the coldest nights of the whole year. And so how this works is that the theory is that if you count it in the summer, there are a lot more people out because it's pretty survivable, except in a heat wave, to be out. In the winter, if things get really bad, let's say you have a lot of challenges and your family has had to create some boundaries, they might let you come in one night if there was the potential you could freeze to death. In the summer, that's not going to happen, if that makes sense. So that gives us one of the, in a sense, purest numbers. We also always know that it is still undercounting. And what we see in Durham, and we know across the country it's undercounting, but there's 10 different theories on how much it's undercounting, so we're really not sure yet. Did I bump it again? Okay, here's what we're going to do. I'm going to move this over a little bit. back. It's back. Okay. Okay. Just make sure I don't back into it. So in Durham, what we're seeing is the total number of people that were unsheltered and that they're experiencing homelessness. And that's people that are on the streets, in abandoned buildings, in cars, and at the emergency shelters went up 8% from 2023 into 2024. And that's tracking pretty normal with many places. And one of the interesting pieces is the number of unsheltered people. So not in a shelter, but just out on the corners and things and in tents. That has gone up 123% since 2020. It actually from 2018 to 2023 went up 300%. So we're seeing massive increases in that. And a lot of it has to do with changes in what housing is costing. That is really one of the biggest contributors. One of the other pieces we are seeing that's interesting is we have historically not counted Latinx individuals during the PIT counts. Part of this is that because there is often concern about if one is undocumented or has other people with them that are undocumented, what the implications could be. So they do not often reveal in a sense. However, there's a pocket of Eastern Durham where a number of houses that were used as almost like to us congregate shelter, like 20 people in them. A lot of times folks will come, work, bunk up in houses. Those houses, gentrification finally hit that neighborhood. And so and it was about 3 months beforehand that happened. And so that's part of why we suddenly started seeing Latinx individuals in the last couple of years. The other thing that's really increased, and I don't have the number on here, but we are seeing families on a very regular basis who are unsheltered for extended periods. So when I came back into the area in 2019, I kept saying, where like the families and stuff? Like there have to be people sleeping in cars because through my prior work, we worked with partners in LA and San Francisco, and whole churches had converted their parking lots during the week to being safe havens for people to come and park with bathrooms and different things. And I was like, this has to be the case here. And they were like, no. And that was true 5 years ago. That was really not something that was happening. Coming out of COVID, that is something we are seeing 30 to 35, 40, 45 families every week that are waiting for extended periods to get into shelter or into housing. That's a very regular thing that we're now seeing. So in terms of our work at Housing for New Hope, and these kind of efforts parallel what many organizations do. I will say what's a little unusual about us is a lot of times groups are either doing homeless services or affordable housing. We're unusual in that we're kind of working in both spaces. So that means that a couple of us at the agency are at a lot of different tables and kind of get to see the systems and how they play and don't play. So it's a very interesting piece, but our response is really around these three areas: street outreach, supportive housing, and affordable housing. And so what street outreach does is these teams, we are designated by the city and the county actually to be the official, what's called the unsheltered coordinating agency. So we are out regularly working with people that are experiencing unsheltered homelessness. We have a hotline people call in on and let us know they've seen folks. And one of the gifts for us in Durham that isn't always the case, I suspect it would likely be the case here too, is in Durham, excuse me, in Chapel Hill, is that 95% of the calls we get are people calling out of concern, of like, somebody keeps sleeping in the gazebo in the park in my neighborhood and somebody should come check on them kind of piece, not a very angry call. The angry corridor is like all in one area for us in Durham, as it is in many places. So for the most part, the calls are very generous and gracious. And we often go out regularly and build relationships. And it can take 2 and 3 and 4 years sometimes to build relationships with folks so that they are willing to have a conversation about housing. Because our goal is always, 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 we want to get folks connected to housing, because what we know is if we can connect folks to housing and that stability can be created, then they are far more likely to connect to supportive services around primary care and mental health and substance use. A few years ago, some research was done, at least for us in Durham. And before I make this statement, let me say we work very closely with our friends at the shelters. We look at the shelters as, I assume most of us don't love spending time in the emergency room. My theory is if we go to the emergency room, we want to be there long enough to either be sent home with what we need or sent on to the specialist that can help us get to where we need. And that's how we view emergency shelters. I make that statement because what we found in Durham was if somebody went straight from being unsheltered into housing, the likelihood that they would connect with primary care and mental health and substance use supports was in the 60 to 70% range. If they went to the shelter first, it was in the teens. So it's just not, and again, that's nothing against shelters and how shelters function. It's an emergency shelter. It's just a really challenging situation. And we're blessed to have the partners that are willing very much to do that work. So we get a lot of calls in from the city. Many of you have probably heard of the HEART team that has launched in Durham, which is the Unarmed Response Teams, crisis response. So we work very closely with them. We have generally, like I said, try to get people in housing. We also have the ability to divert folks out of the system if they have somewhere they can go that's stable. So anybody been to that Home Depot out on 15501? Or maybe been out back of the Home Depot on 15501, there's always an interesting mix of vehicles back there. So for about 4 months, there was a truck out there full of a like general contractor kind of materials. Somebody had come here thinking there was work. It didn't work out. They had family and friends and actually work back in California if they could get there. The truck needed $11,000 or $12,000 in repairs. We know enough in the system to go, okay, 12,000 sounds like a lot, but if 12,000 will get someone back to housing and a job and a support system, that's cheaper than a year in housing in Durham. And so we were able to support them doing that. So it's always driven by they have connections and things. It's not we'll hear in the news at times about people being diverted and put on buses and sent places. It's nothing of the sort. It's actually a pretty creative way to help people get back where their systems are, because part of what we're experiencing in the Triangle, I remember when I first went to Duke this would have been about 97 for graduate school. I met the person who ran what was then called the soup kitchen downtown. And we went there, she pulled out like Money Magazine and kept showing us Money Magazine. This was when, the Triangle was all one in terms of metropolitan area. And we'd hit some like #1 place to live in America list. And she said, this is such a problem, this magazine, because everyone sees it and thinks there are going to be jobs here when they get here. But if you looked at the magazine, everybody on that magazine had at least a master's degree or a doctorate in terms of there being accessible jobs. And so a lot of people would come here thinking there was work and then there wasn't. And so feel like we're experiencing some of that again. A lot of us kind of in the system, every time we get some new, it's the best place to X. We're like, no, this is not helpful. Because it really does create a draw for people that oftentimes there aren't the opportunities here that they would hope. I did it again, didn't I? Okay. So one of the most important solutions that we have in working in homelessness, and certainly for our agency, is supportive housing that can connect people. Again, they have their own lease, whether it's in a campus that we own and operate, or with one of our more than 30 landlord partners in town. And if we can get them into housing and then connect them to services, we're going to be much, much more stable. And I said earlier that oftentimes what we're seeing is severe and persistent mental health and substance use disorder. It's about 60 to 65% of the time we see those two things wrapped around each other. You will not be surprised to hear that comes from not having the right medical care or any access to medical care. Someone used substances to self-medicate, and then it became an issue on top of the severe and persistent mental health. But that is often a lot of what we're seeing. And part of it also is over time, obviously, we have moved away from a lot of institutionalization for people, and there's very good reasons for that with severe and persistent mental health issues. What did not follow that transition entirely were community-based resources to ensure everybody had treatment or that there was enough access to housing. So in some cases, the homelessness system is sort of picking up for a breakdown in many systems, but particularly in that system. And so what we're going to do with this work is we have both partner landlords that people live with. or they live on one of our campuses, so the housing is stable, they are going to contribute no more than 30% of their income. And that means, if they're on disability income, they'll be at around the 900 to 1,000 range. So a third of 30% of that. They may come with no income, and 30% of zero is zero. So we will work with them over time to connect to services and other kinds of supports. We make sure that when they move in, that they have the basics they need for their bed, bath, and kitchen to get up and running. And one of the real interesting pieces that we've struggled with, and this has been part of what's happened with gentrification in Durham, is we suddenly, about 3.5 years ago, started losing a lot of partner landlords. So when the values started going up, so Durham is interesting in that it has the highest percentage of residents who are securing their housing through rentals. It's about 41%. It's the highest of any city, major city in the state of North Carolina. And around 2018, about 30% of the units, the rental units in Durham, you could have secured for $800 a month or less. By 2022, yeah, I was going to say, if you've been living in Chapel Hill, you may not have known the bargains that were across until about 4 years ago. I know people think we're crazy when we say that. I mean, but in 4 years, we went down to less than 10% of the units were under $800 a month. And prices just started going up so fast. There was a property that we looked at purchasing. This is a great example. It had 24, it was 6 buildings with 4 units in each. We got a hold of the rent roll, and one person was paying more than $550 a month for a 2-bedroom, 1-bath house. This was in 2020. Number of reasons we couldn't acquire it. It went back on the market 6 months later, had a new owner, already was back on the market. We got a hold of the rent roll again. There was 1 unit out of the 24 that's had someone under $800. And some of them are at 900 and 1,000. It's an area where I travel a lot. And I literally was watching people just move out, because when they get ready to sell, they will often let everybody's leases go to month, which makes it much faster and easier for people to move out. So part of what we started seeing in Durham was a lot of people who'd owned rental properties, like 1 or 2 or 3 houses, the value skyrocketed. They were getting older. It was an investment for them. They sold. New folks, we kept running into folks, particularly from Wake County, who moved in to Wake with children in schools. So this is a story they kept telling me. They wanted Wake County schools, so they moved into Wake County. The kids are all off at college and living life somewhere else now, and they want to live somewhere cool with a downtown. Asheville's too far. So they want to come to Durham. And so they're buying these homes, and they want to live in them. And the number of people that come to us that are like, I walked out on my porch after I bought this house and closed on it and was like, I'm the gentrifier. And I was like, yes, we can talk about that and maybe have that conversation with your therapist too. That maybe you should be a little more observant earlier on. See, we can have a little bit of fun about this a little bit, but it was a very serious thing. So a lot of times people were buying them and wanting them for their own use. And so that caused a lot of displacement. So as a community, we have had to put in a lot more funding for incentives for people to be willing to partner with us. And now that rental rates they're down about 8 or 9% over the last year. That's actually helping because so much of the new stuff in Durham is coming online. So it's creating some new openings for us, which is really, really helping a lot. The other piece we do is work really closely with a little bit of affordable housing. Building affordable housing is a very complex piece to do because of the way tax credits work. One of the things that I'll jump ahead because I know someone always asks this question, why can't cities require that there be affordable housing in any new development? Yes, that's always the response. Talk to our friends at the legislature. So cities do not have that right or ability unless it is land they own or money that they are investing in order to build. That's the only way they can do it. And so that's been one of the challenges, is that it cannot be required in any way. And again, it's also just so very complex. I mean, Durham back in 2019 approved what is still the largest affordable housing bond in North Carolina history. Even Wake County's wasn't as big as Durham's was. We're just now 5 years in starting to see some of those properties come on board beyond the ones the housing authority are building into mixed use redevelopments with mixed use. And part of the slowdown was when the market went crazy in terms of cost of materials and interest rates. There became huge gaps for almost all the projects. So at one point, the county, which usually doesn't do that work, chipped in $10 million to help 4 projects close their gaps so they could get moving on. That was about a year ago. So we're seeing more coming. And one of the pieces, I'm part of a group attached to Duke that's been doing some research on what we call naturally occurring affordable housing. So maybe it doesn't have technical government restrictions on it, but it's just always been a little cheaper. The issue with that always is somebody can decide that that's an exciting property and then try and buy it, and it suddenly is no longer naturally occurring affordable housing. So last year, we actually, in partnership with the city and the county, an opportunity came to us to purchase, that actually had restrictions on it, 48 units of senior affordable housing that was next to a piece of property we already owned. There was a little bit of land we'd never developed. That property had never developed. That if you put them together, you could put another 50 units and create a whole campus. The affordable housing bond money had already been used. The affordable housing loan fund was all fully expended. And so the city and county literally had to come in together and just approve $6 million in about 4 or 5 months to purchase that. Because historically cities don't have and counties don't have plans for monitoring when the properties lose their protections. So now we're pushing to, you've got to monitor this and have a plan. Because we're losing the naturally occurring and stuff that's hitting their 30-year mark in terms of restrictions. But a lot of times what happens is it'll be restrictions at a certain income level. So for example, this is our Coal Mill Place apartments. It's small. It's like 10 units of 2 and 3 bedrooms. And a household can't make any more than 50% of the area median income. And for us, Durham, Orange, Chatham are all in the same, we're all in the same area. So everyone's, and it's really funny. I do some work with folks down in Pittsburgh, and it's sort of like, as I drive out of Durham, like the Durham people are mad about the numbers and the income in Chapel Hill because it skews the numbers. And then the people in Chatham are upset about the number. The Chapel Hill people are upset about the numbers in Chatham County, Northeast. It's skewing, it's all real. It's actually really skewing the numbers. But it's just kind of funny. Everybody's pointing fingers at each other about how it's not working. Go for it. So what it means is a lot of properties will have, we talk a lot about area median income. And so properties will often be set at, a lot of times when you hear about affordable housing, it'll be set at 60 to 80% of the area median income. And at this point, for us, 80% of AMI can be over $100,000 for a family of 4.
Is that the area median income, or that's half of the area?
That is 50% of the area median income for one family, one individual, one person. Yes. So, and yes, no, that's a really good, thank you for asking for that clarification. So that is very much the numbers we work with. What's interesting is that rent in these properties, the way it's set up, and low income housing tax credit properties, which you hear the phrase LIHTC sometimes on the news, that's low income housing tax credit. They will be set like this, and then they'll have a set amount of rent. So oftentimes what we say is, if you are paying more than 30% of your income towards your housing, then you are cost burdened. However, the way the system works is that, if somebody moves in and they're making $35,400 for one unit, the unit has a rent on it. It's already set, and it's going to be like in this property, it's probably about $1,000 a month. Well, $12,000 a year out of 35. I mean, you're very close to breaking your statistics there. So that's an interesting piece in the background that I didn't know until I came into this work, that it can be labeled as affordable, but it may actually not fall in that 30% range where it's manageable, if that makes sense. I shared about Carver Creek. I got ahead of myself on that one. Yeah, so I did bring with me just a couple papers. When you go today, there's annual reports that have a little bit of that story about Carver Creek and some of the work that we do. You'll also see, if you are in Durham County, we share with folks. People often say, what do I give somebody who is asking for money? Our encouragement always is, if you're in Durham County, they may have these for Chapel Hill too, I'm not sure. But these are contact information for us. And we often have folks, they may get a little agitated if you give it to them. We have people call in and say, in a more colorful way than I'm about to say, I keep being given these cards. I've gotten 5 of them now. What is this about? And that's great, because that helps us start a conversation, go see them and talk with them. So if you're in Durham County or get over that way, I'm happy for you to take one of those. And then the State of Housing and Homelessness has more of the data that I've mentioned embedded into it. So you can get a sense of what's going on. And one of the interesting pieces in here is just sharing what we're seeing year to year in terms of, we saw a 31% increase in folks with substance use disorders among the unsheltered population in 1 year, 23% severe mental illness, and 34% increase in people that would meet the definition of chronically homeless. So it's really, really intensifying in a lot of ways. So let me stop there, because my sense is you'll have good questions for me.
Oh, okay. Take a short break.
Okay.
And our meeting, we are an all volunteer association, and we take this time to pass the baskets for donations. And we have ground rules for our question and answer. Raise your hands and wait for the microphone, and ask only one question at a time. And then we'll get around for second questions if we have them. So, okay, I'll start on this side first.
Yes. Once you get a homeless person into shelter, that's kind of only the beginning.
Right.
Do you follow up, or what is your commitment to that person, and what happens?
That is a great question. So we have, with supportive housing, there are a couple of different levels. So there's one program that nationally is known as rapid rehousing. And it is for folks who've kind of hit a bump in the road, they're unsheltered, and they need help to get up and going. So they can only have rental supports for 2 years, and they have connections to case management in that period. So for them, it's they often only need a couple of types of support, and it might be around childcare, it might be more job training, and they'll be able to get up and running pretty quickly. In other cases, like with our campuses, and actually for our supportive housing that's spread around the community, it's not unusual for folks to be with us 5, 6, 7, 8 years. Oftentimes there's a great example of a woman named Mary who, when she first came to our Andover apartments, her mental health was in a very challenging place. Her substance use was pretty significant. She actually had someone else acting as her financial agent, so she couldn't take care of her own money. She was able to get sober, and then able to get her mental health challenges to a better place, and take responsibility for her own finances, and then connect to a housing choice voucher. That was 6.5 years. And so oftentimes, just because of everything people have gone through, it can take a long time. Yeah.
When I was living in Pasadena, we had a really interesting program of the city police department. And there are those who go around on bicycles or just walk their beats. And the program was that the policeman would walk his or her beat, but also partnered with a clinician who worked for the clinic that was attached to the police department. And they knew all of the chronically homeless people in the area, and there were a lot, and which mental illness or substance abuse problems they had. And normally people chronically unhoused are have mental illness problems or need some sort of medication that they can't get and can't be responsible because of their problem for taking it. So the clinician from the clinic and the cop on the beat would walk together and visit all the people and make sure the ones who needed particular, medications for schizophrenia or bipolar would have it every single day, make sure they took it. And a lot of the people who were treated that way were able to then function more normally, to at least be in some of the shelter housing and get more on their feet and not be just crazy looped out because they weren't getting the kind of treatment. Do you have any programs similar to that?
Well, no, I'm smiling because we are actually right now in conversation with a couple different organizations to bring more street medicine in place, because what we found is a lot of the folks that really are in a position to move into housing and want to have, because one thing that's, and I'm still working on how best to express this, there are many people that you will see on corners that have disability. They have income, they have housing, or they've been offered housing. They may not want it because they don't want to have to lose $300 a month of their $1,000 in order to be housed. So that very much really does happen. We're also, though, discovering that there's a group kind of along lines of what you're saying, where if we could connect them to street medicine, where we can bring out a clinician, and there are clinicians already. There's crisis intervention teams. There's clinicians on the new heart teams. We in the past have actually had clinicians as part of our teams. We don't currently, but we're looking at adding, nurse practitioners, substance use counselors, right on the teams, because there's a group that, again, to your point, if we could help them get more stable while they're unsheltered, they would be in a place to have a conversation about housing, if that makes sense. It can be no. You're naming something that's, we often have a hard time naming in the system, but there's just a lot of extra activity. I mean, sometimes people just have a hard time relating to others or feeling safe around others. And sometimes we have folks that are from some of the caring systems that get very hesitant to try and put boundaries on, but sometimes the boundaries are how we have safety for folks and help them move forward. I mean, I'm always amazed at, like, with our supportive housing campuses where they're all living together. One of the residents will come and say, John's gone off his meds 4 days ago. We just wanted you to know we're seeing some things at night. And they don't mean it in an uncaring way. They're like, it's like somebody pulling the fire alarm to be like, we think we smell smoke. You might want to check on this. And it's great. I mean, that you get to that point of people caring for each other in that way.
Thank you. A very good presentation. I'm curious, what role do houses of faith-based organizations play in this picture? In New York City, where we came from, the Society for Ethical Culture, for example, had a women's shelter that they operated on all year round through the Osborne Association, which was very much like your organization, which coordinated. A lot of the houses of worship in New York City have shelters of one kind or another, or at least provide food assistance.
So my easy answer is, as with hospitals and universities, faith-based groups were the ones that started the majority of them. What's interesting is that depending on when some of them were started here, like our organization was started by the Durham Presbyterian Council, but they did it in a time where you couldn't get HUD dollars if you're a faith-based organization at all. And so it's never technically been faith-based. It never has, and it's never really had much of that ethos. I think part of what we run into, and I'm clergy in the United Methodist tradition, so I say this as generously as possible. We have some friends that are kind of on the far right fundamentalist side, that their approach is pretty intensive in terms of the changes you. If I wasn't being videoed, I would say something different here. There's a great article in the Indie Week about Durham Rescue Mission that is worth going and reading, is my honest answer. And I'm quoted in there in a calm way, which is really good. But well, what it comes down to is I often say to folks, I will often say to folks, you need to kind of do the reflection in your heart and your mind of how much you think someone's situation is their choices and how much of it is systemic or situational. There's things about you may have studied adverse childhood impacts and pieces like that. You really got to do that work a little bit. That'll help you know how you're approaching people. That's a really, really, really good measure for you. And I think what we have found is a lot of the very, very conservative Christian groups that run like a rescue mission, their feeling is you should be able to roll in and go dry like cold turkey. And there are people for whom that structure, that's what's finally going to turn it for them. That is absolutely, there are people who are successful from that, truly, truly are. However, our experience in general is that many people need to take that kind of harm reduction approach of, if you're getting high 7 days a week, let's talk about going to 6, then let's talk about going to 5, let's talk about going to 4, and then have a system where if you relapse and the percentage is high, then how do we kind of get back on the wagon, so to speak? That's not a great phrase, but how that kind of works. So does that help? Is that a helpful or too much answer? Yeah. Read the Indie Week article.
Does Section 8 housing still work? Is it still around? I worked with homeless or subsidized housing for a number of years, housing authorities, and Section 8 back in the day was a pretty good solution for a lot of people. Is it still viable?
Yes, with an asterisk. So it's now called housing choice vouchers for the most part. And housing authorities also run that. So one of the interesting facts is we're making all these changes with the housing authority in Durham and building all these new pieces. They still serve way more people through housing choice vouchers, probably double than they do actually on their own properties. The challenge nationally, I think, is the wait lists are huge. I remember during COVID, the wait lists in Louisville were like 10,000 people waiting for housing. And oftentimes, housing authorities are underfunded. It's a very challenging place to work because you've either got landlords or tenants, or everyone's yelling at you one way or another, it feels like. And so getting those offices to be high function is a real challenge. They are effective. They really are effective for people. And what we find in Durham is that, and I've run into this in other places, there's hesitancy to take housing choice vouchers. It's not in Durham about the clients. It is about the experience of working with a housing choice voucher office. And we are also a landlord, and it can take 10 and 12 months. I mean, and I don't mean this is going to sound very arrogant, but there are times where if I didn't work directly with the city council and county commissioners and others, I wouldn't have the ability to call in that I do to the housing choice voucher office and be like, I really need this fixed. We're not a private company with a lot of extra cash sitting around. So a lot of it for us is people's struggles with working with the office, not with the clients they'd serve. Yeah. Sorry, there's been a question over here for quite a while. Okay, just making sure.
Thank you. Thank you for your presentation. I was a case manager for Community Care of North Carolina for many years. I'm very with Housing for New Hope. Had a lot of clients on Carver Street,
Yes.
to be exact. One of the things I would like to know if you have any information about our 65 plus population and numbers of homelessness among our I don't want to say elderly, aging population. I know. In my room.
Way to read your audience. No, it's definitely increasing, and we're seeing two major changes in supportive housing over the last 5 or 10 years. I mean, there's probably more, but the two really stand out. One is that people are aging in place. I mean, some folks, their best bet long term is to just stay in the housing and stay there and stay there. But we are seeing a lot of aging in place in places that weren't necessarily built for that. The property that we bought, we knew that we were saving a bunch of people from being evicted. When I got in and got to sit down and talk with the residents, we knew that like urban ministries had referred a lot of people. There's a lot of housing choice vouchers in that building. I was fascinated is not the word. I don't have the right word for it. The number of people who told me stories about having lived in the same house for 20 years in East Durham and losing their housing. They were homeless at like 65 and 70 and then ended up at Carver Creek. So I mean, we actually saved people a second being forced to move. The other thing we're seeing that's interesting is the situation with drugs has changed so much. I mean, you hear about people needing more Narcan, and we've just added Narcan to our properties. Somebody said to me who's been in the work for a long time, said, I missed the day of cocaine and hard liquor. And I was like, I'm sorry, what? And and they said because the drugs now are so hard and so dangerous, and we're seeing so many people overdose, and we're also tending to see somewhat related to that, somewhat not, more violence out of folks that are in the properties, to the point where we're having to rethink how properties are constructed, and we have one we may eventually take down and reconstruct so that it's got different security. It's changing pretty dramatically. So yeah, it's the whole piece with the hard drug. It's unreal. I mean, it's just, and it's not just people overdosing. I mean, it's people, I mean, we're having to do more work for secondary trauma for staff because of what they're experiencing when someone uses it. It's not the kind that kills them, but it takes them off into a whole nother universe. Yes. That is my experience. Yes. Yeah. I've learned how to move faster than I used to for that.
I'm imagining running away from things, but at any rate, I was, one of my issues with some of the faith-based initiatives are you go to such and such a place, and in order to get a meal, you have to involve yourself in prayer. And so, in other words, you're only being fed if you're willing to be proselytized to. And I wondered, some of these housing things, do some of these people act like that the same way with housing?
It's very, That Indie Week article is a really good article to read about Durham Rescue Mission. And there's actually a national organization that coordinates all that work of the rest. Not every place with Rescue Mission in the name is necessarily kind of fundamentalist Baptist. The high percentage of them is. I think those are the groups. I mean, that's something that comes out in the article, is the high expectation of attending worship multiple times a week in order to, not necessarily to be fed, but to have your housing and to be involved, and issues they're concerned around people from within the LGBTQ community comes out pretty fast. You could lose your place there for that. And so, from what we understand, so I feel like it's pretty limited, and people tend to know those places. One of the things we struggle with in Durham is that the Durham Rescue Mission advertises far and wide. Even down in Spartanburg, there's advertisements. So people will come not knowing fully, it is not a homeless shelter. It is not a homeless program. They do not report their numbers in through HUD. And so it's kind of a mix of, this may be my quote in there, something like it's a mix of a kind of a charity and a treatment program and a couple other things. And so people will come and they won't really fully know kind of what they're signing up for, and worship 4 times a week is a lot. I mean, I didn't go the 2 times a week I was supposed to go in seminary. So 4 seems like a whole lot to me. And then people will exit, and they exit into Durham, and then they're in the system, but they're not from Durham, and we're trying to figure out how to help them. So you can usually detect it if you first check on the name and sort of look at the board and stuff like that. If that's the case. Yeah, sorry. I'm trying to be very careful how I answer that question. Read the article.
I'm somewhat math challenged, and I was looking at the front page of your flyer, and how do those numbers on the front relate to each other? 405 people experience homelessness. 78, is that 78% of the 405 are experiencing it for the first time?
So yeah, so if you look at the number, so the 405, that was the total number of people that were unsheltered or in the shelter.
Okay.
Then 78% of those were experiencing homelessness for the first time, which, this is going to sound strange. That's actually a good thing in that you're not seeing as much repeat. So 22% is repeat situations. It's also not great that there's 78% are new to it, but
Okay.
that's a little better than repeat. And then 172 was the number that were unsheltered. So if you took the 405 less the 172,
Okay.
that tells you the number that are being served in some way through the shelters or another situation. And then the families experiencing homelessness, that's 170 out of the 405.
170 people or 170 families?
Households. Yes. So families.
Okay. So that 405 number includes everybody.
Yes.
And everything else is sort of a breakdown of what makes
Yes.
sense. Okay.
Yes.
Got it.
Thank you.
Thanks.
I'll have our little Sanford School of Public Policy students make that clearer next year.
Anybody else have?
I know that the Durham Main Library gets a lot of homeless that like to hang out there. Partly it's close to the rescue mission, and I think it's one of the
And
things.
it's right across from the Urban Ministries, the shelter.
Yeah.
Both
And-
shelters.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, Urban
Yes,
Ministries and Families
Ministries,
Moving
yeah.
Forward are each
So-
on one side of the building,
That's right.
library.
Do you work with any agencies like the library system that experiences a lot of contact with homeless?
We do. We actually will do trainings and different things with library staff if that's what they're looking for, to kind of know how to respond. We've been partnering with Go Triangle, interestingly, has had a lot of, I'd never heard this phrase before, non-destination riders. Big group gets on the buses at Moore Square in Raleigh, because they can kind of sleep. It's changed a little bit in the last year, but they could kind of sleep in the building. They could hop on the bus when the bus is cranked up for the day and ride directly to Durham. And then they were in Durham, and they might go over to the library or Urban Ministries for lunch. And so we were actually providing some training for them of how to respond in the cards and different pieces. So again, we're pretty fortunate that most times people are wanting to work with us closely. We also work really closely with the hospitals. So we have a lot of deep relationships for us at Duke, both Duke Regional and at Big Duke, where we're able to, as appropriate, share information back and forth, and try and connect people through that have needs. So yeah.
One of our online people found an Indie Week article called "We Come Here Broken and Desperate, a deep look at the Durham Rescue Mission."
That's it.
The one from, it was April?
Yes.
Okay,
Yes.
perfect. He wanted to check to see if that was the right one.
That's the one.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Questions? Okay, well, thank you very
Thank you.
much for a very good presentation.
Oh, I made it a very blue screen. Sorry.
Wait, we have now time for announcements. And Laura.
I'm just taking over the mic. Yes, do come here next week. We will be meeting here again next week in person, same time. And we are doing a little talk. We being the royal we, because it's my talk, on looking at the Wake SPCA. And first of all, just that little tiny overview of it and of the volunteer stuff there, but also ethical issues that the people who work there have to face. So hopefully people will attend.
Of course, just remembering the Change for Change, we are supporting New Hope Fire Department this quarter, and they are a volunteer fire department in Orange County. Thank you.
And next Sunday after our program, we will be discussing a book by Ehrman Diaz called Trust. If you have read it, please come. If you haven't read it and are curious, please come, and we'll be happy to have you. We'll be meeting in the Columbia room over there just after the meeting, 3:30.
All right, Dorothy.
Two things that I've been remiss in announcing. Sometime after we did our Rise Against Hunger event, Molly Mast, who's with Triangle Free Thought Society, reached out to several of the organizations about doing a secular summer picnic in September, fortunately, not in August. And I just keep forgetting to put it in the newsletter, but I wanted to make sure people were aware. And this will be on the Raleigh side of things, because it's at it's at Lake Crabtree, I think. And I will put it in the newsletter, but and now I can't find the date because I don't know how to use my phone effectively. It's September 14th at noon. It's entirely social. So, we might want to carpool and head out that way, but we really, want to continue this working together with other secular, or getting to know other secular groups. Related to that, folks who are postcarding, if you need anything, let me know. I meant to bring more packets and I didn't get them done in time. But if anybody wants a packet, reach out, I'll get it to you. But related to that, I met with Helen Wolfson, who is the area coordinator and who is coordinating 16,000 postcards and the groups that are writing them, which I think is extraordinary. It's like double what she did last time. But she also made me aware that the Eno River Unitarian Universalist Church has a subgroup of secular folks that Helen actually runs. And they are going to be screening a documentary called Bad Faith on Saturday, September 7th and Sunday, September 8th. And she has lined up a couple of speakers to go with the screening. And one of them is somebody we tried to get and did not succeed. And I'm forgetting Nancy McLean from Duke, who's written some really interesting political books. And then the other one is somebody she knows through the congregation who she thinks very highly of. So those are free, open to everybody. And I watched it. It was very depressing. It is available free or for $1 on one of the channels. Very depressing, but important. And it's all about the religious right. I'm sorry, I should have put that. And particularly not the religious right, Christian nationalists. So she sent me the blurb. I talked to her on Monday, I think. So I've got the blurb and it'll go in.
Anything else? All righty. Now it's time for Jay's closing words.
This will be the last of my feeble attempts at humor that relate to housing or homes. And to be honest, it's very difficult for me to explain the carcinogenic roofing on my house. But I'll try as best as I can. I got the worst out of the way quick. You know, they say that Gretchen's house is haunted. Have you heard that? Everybody here talks about it. They say your house is haunted, but that's funny. I've lived there 200 years and never noticed anything strange. Finally, I was hoping that Fred would be here tonight, this afternoon, because I got a little story about he and Mara, and don't mean to divulge, you know, strange things. And is Fred on the? You'll have to tell him. Well, Mara told Fred one time, honey, that young couple who just moved in next door to us, they seem like such a loving twosome. Every morning when he leaves the house, he kisses her goodbye. And every evening when he comes home, he brings her a dozen roses. Now, Fred, why can't you do that? And Fred said, gosh, I hardly know the woman.
Well, thanks for that, Jay. Well, our meeting